Uh, so a bit about me. I've been in Drupal land for around 7 years now. I've been working with Jyoti in Washington, D.C. for 2 years. And before that was mostly freelance and some agency work in Canada. So today we're going to look at annotation plugins, specifically within Drupal views. They are a lot of them. There's actually 17 different types of annotation plugins used within Drupal 8 views. So we're going to start out really basic in case anyone here is not familiar with Drupal 8 or not very familiar with views. I'm expecting this is going to be replicative for most people, but might as well just go quick intro. Yep, not surprised. There's definitely, 60% of sites are still on Drupal 7. So there's definitely people that are getting introduced to Drupal 8, especially over the next 2 to 3 years as we migrate more and more sites. So in Drupal 8, views has been moved from contrib land into core. And this is great. I like it. It means it's one less module that I always install. And so kind of heading for Drupal 8 views is you can create customized lists and queries from your database. It is both, that's an inadequate description, but is entirely what it does. It just provides a UI. You could be doing that with queries and custom SQL or whatever your database language is in, but the UI is a lot easier, both for maintenance purposes and for building. You don't actually have to be an SQL expert to provide a relatively performant list. So Drupal 8 had a whole lot of advertising about getting off the island. And one of the new things it introduced was a plugin system. So there was a lot of discussion about best ways to provide reusable code that was very modular. And one of the old methods was the hook views plugins, where you just wrote in exactly what the plugin did into one file that then was loaded every single load. It works. It worked for Drupal 7. It would still work in Drupal 8, but it has disadvantages. Specifically, the performance is, well, it has to load the file every time. It has to actually process the PHP. Whereas with the new method of using the Doctrine annotations library, it just processes a bit of text rather than actually loading the whole PHP process for it. So this is more performant, and also as an added benefit, instead of you have one file with your plugin, another file describing what it does and providing default options to it, you have it all in one place. So a really simple annotation is just an @ and then the name of the type of plugin and then the plugin's ID. In this case, a views filter. You may notice this is actually a whole class heading here with the comment and the in group. That's just used by the Drupal API site to perform nice documentation that doesn't have to have actual, human interfacing to just generate the documentation. But a lot of plugins need a bit more than just a name. So for the more complicated ones, you have, great, glad the captions are being useful to everyone. So for a more bulky plugin like a view style, you have the ID. You might have noticed that on the previous example, it was just a name inside of the brackets, didn't mention ID. By default, if there's one argument to the plugin, it is the ID. In this case, we have an ID and a title. You may notice there's another @ translation. This just provides the Drupal translation API for that word. It's like the built-in T function. And what options are available depends entirely on the plugin. Thanks, Alex. I figure I'm not having much options to get fancy, so I might as well get fancy while I'm on screen. So, as we discussed, well, as Dries discussed in the Dries note this morning, PHP 7 is running out of time in its lifespan. And with Drupal 9, we're going to be mostly on PHP 8. For the annotation plugins, we've mostly been using Doctrine Annotations library. We don't yet know whether we'll be moving to the built-in annotations, but there are going to be built-in annotations in PHP 8. I suspect it'll probably be in Drupal 10 or 11 before we move over there, so as to support older sites, which are, because a lot of people have a hard time updating to PHP in as fast as the PHP project is updating, especially since Ubuntu provides security support. So in the new PHP 8, it's still under development. It's not going to have a first release until at least this winter, but it is basically the same as Doctrine Annotations, except it's going to be 2 @ symbols instead of 1. So now we move on to views plugin types. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of them. Some of them are, well, some of them are you're going to be unlikely to actually ever want to change, but we'll just go for a quick rundown of them all. Views access, it's pretty common because, well, access controls is one of the major good points of a quality CMS. Most of the views access controls are provided by the user module, although other modules that provide access also have been known to provide views access controls. I personally have never had need to build a custom views access that wasn't just good enough using node access. So views areas, that's like the message area, the main content results, the footer and the header. Those are also provided by plugins. You can create new ones, but again, it's one that most sites really, you don't need to create new ones. And in general, you may notice that this here says views area quote broken. That's because if any plugin is broken, well, by broken, I mean doesn't exist or can't load, views replaces it with a broken titled plugin that then the rest of the view will try to successfully load. Sometimes it will fail, but most often it will load and just one field will be missing or the message area will be missing, whatever, but you have a mostly functional site still. So if you're using contextual filters, there's a really annoying aspect. On the UI, they're called contextual filters. On the back end, they're called arguments. I don't know why this was done. I missed, there's probably some historical reasons, but having a different term makes searching for it really hard. There's actually 3 different primary views argument plugins. There's the straight views argument that just lets you select a date type it depends on what field you choose. If you choose a date field, it will provide a date field as the default argument plugin to use. Just a second, I can grab you a slide link. Yeah, there's a slide link in the channel. No worries. So yeah, it will provide you the views argument plugin that it knows best. Generally speaking, it is correct. Most of the views arguments do not have extra plugins that you theoretically could choose. For the views argument default, that provides you a default value if you don't manually specify the value when you send the view to render. For the views argument defaults, you can choose which plugins to use and then configure them. There's also a views argument validator, which, unlike most of these views plugins, is almost entirely provided by modules other than views, both node, user, taxonomy. And that just validates that some number that you enter is actually a node ID, not just a random number, for example. Then, as many of you are hopefully familiar, the views cache plugins, mostly tag-based and time-based, if you want a performant view, you're going to need to use them, except for in the case of using facets and search API, in which case you have to not use them, which is a nice little gotcha. If you miss it, you will have views that don't properly update. The views module provides all of the core options for caching. Search API does also provide some others. So one of the more commonly actually modified ones in the contrib land, I've never modified one for not contrib, but for contrib, I've worked on views slideshow, which was mostly style, but a bit of display, is the views display plugin, which lets you render your data as a RSS feed or as a open GML map or as a table or as a block. I've never actually seen views display extender in use. I understand there is a views display extender built into simple XML sitemap, but I don't know what data it provides. Never had a reason to use it. So including it for completeness, but I can't say I can provide any real recommendations on it. Then there's the views exposed form plugin. There's the basic one that comes with core, and then you have the better exposed filters project. Basically, it's a rare site that I don't want to use better exposed filters, and I've never come across an instance where it was worthwhile building a new filter plugin rather than just doing hook views form alter. Not mulcher, alter. Well, that is not the most accurate captioning, but we'll take it. So then there's also a bunch of querying specific plugins. There's views joins, views sorts, views relationships, and views query. These all perform the special changing up of your UI selections into magical SQL or Postgres or whatever language you're using. The likelihood that you actually need to modify these ones is fairly rare. but they're there. I suggest keeping your weaponry out of views, but if you want to sell medieval weaponry, views can provide a good list for you. Yes. So I was slightly unclear about the difference between views style and views display. Views display provides the actual surrounding dis the actual surroundings, like for a feed, it provides the header data, whereas for a block, it provides what type of block it is, where it can be placed. Whereas the style provides the actual content, the twig file for, is this a bunch of rows connected together, or is this a table with individual fields in sequence down it? So if we're talking about views rows, you can render things as rows. That's a fairly common way to do it. And when you're using any of the displays that use rows, then you get to render fields. Again, this is one that it's got a lot of power, but not much use most use cases. Probably the one that I have modified most, since I've been a part-time maintainer of the Drupal 8 Views slideshow module, is view style, which is basically everything about the inside of the view before you get to actual results. And then in terms of actually using plugins in random projects rather than using one plugin in a lot of projects, the ones I've used most are views field and views filter. These are kind of similar to views argument. You get no UI to select what plugin you are going to use, but you do have a full UI to configure the plugin if the plugin has configuration options. So they're not the most friendly to alter because there's no UI for them, but using the configuration workflow, you can. So for example, in this stripped down views, we have a bunch of things that are minimized so that you can see the structure. And then down here, we have plugin ID, taxonomy index, TID node depth. That can be any filter plugin ID. And if you just import that configuration back into Drupal, then it will remember that. And even if you import and export 100 times, you'll stay that way because there's no UI that will overwrite it either. Yeah. So one of my favorite little things I found in terms of specifically the taxonomy index is most cases when you select a term that you have hierarchy to, you often want child items to be selected as well. Like you have a taxonomy filter with, say, cars, and then you have a child term of Toyota, Ford, and then you have Fiesta under Ford. If you select a Ford, you want to catch that Fiesta as well. But by default, the general taxonomy filter plugin only will catch things that are selected, that are tagged with Ford rather than Fiesta. But actually in core, there is already a plugin that does that out of the box. That's the taxonomy underbar index underbar TAD underbar depth plugin. I don't actually know why it, well, actually, I do know why it's not selected by default. Performance-wise, checking for depth is costly, but yes, as Rolando was saying, it's like you often do want it, but it is costly. So it's something you should consider. And if you are struggling because you don't actually want to have a node save function to say, if this is tagged with Fiesta, also tag it with Ford, then just adding that extra plugin instead of the default, you'll get a lot better results. It's a performance hit, but if you do proper views caching and you're caching all of your edge as well, it's, well, it's, you have to be aware of it, but it's not the end of the world either. Now I'm just going to switch my screen sharing away from this the presentation to my actual code, since it's kind of hard to view code in the slideshow without it getting really unreadable. So this is the specific taxonomy index TID depth that I was talking about. All of the various views plugins have their own set of functions that you can use. Generally speaking, if I want to have a custom filter, I will usually inherit from one of the core filters rather than the base class, because then I don't have to consider all of the nuances of the query. I can just manually adjust the query how I need it and let the rest of it be taken care of naturally. Now, you might be wondering, why would I want to use plugins versus just normal views hooks? There are views hooks that cover, I'll just put us back onto the presentation so that you can actually continue to see the captioning. So yes, there are views hooks that can do almost everything that views plugins can do. The difference really is a matter of performance and cleanliness. If you're going to have one hook that is doing a dozen different views, it's going to be a long read, and I don't really like having a module file that is 5,000 lines long. Performance-wise, a views plugin is only loaded if it is actually used on the page. Whereas if your module is loaded, the whole module file has to get processed before your page can get loaded. And then beyond that, there's also, if you're doing it within the plugin, you're doing it at the right time, not after the fact. Generally speaking, the views hooks, you can still get it right, but it's often a lot easier to generate the query conditions all as a one set package rather than figuring out, walking through the query conditions and finding the right one to alter. I haven't heard anything about views hooks being dropped. There has been talk about just alter hooks in general being dropped, but there's such a large body of modules that use them that I would be very surprised if they actually get dropped within D9, since there's only a 2-year cycle until Drupal 10. I'm pretty confident that hooks are here for at least that period. If they get depreciated in Drupal 9, I expect that they'll be kept for Drupal 10 and switched to events as a dual system until Drupal 11, at which point the hooks would be dropped. Yes, as Dylan was saying, your UI options with actual plugin versus doing a hook alter is a lot better. You can do form alters as well as hook alters on views and get roughly the same experience, but then you're using multiple alters when you could have one plugin file and have everything in the same spot. It's like either of them will work. It's more a matter of, will this be understandable if I leave this project, come back in 6 months? One file, that's fairly easy to understand. If it's in multiple hooks that mixed with 6 different views, alters, well, I have had to update things like that, and it takes time to refresh your mind. Or for a new person, I hope you've left good documentation. One of the other frequent reasons that I use Views plugins is reusability is a lot easier, because if you like this Views plugin for one site, you can easily copy it and put it into a new site without having to find exactly where in your module files and adjust views IDs. So in Casey, for some of the views, you can see what plugin you're using. Not all the plugins provide a UI to tell you what plugin you're using. If what plugin you're using is a significant issue, you definitely can, in the actual plugin form, you can say, just provide a little HTML field to say, this is X plugin. Like for views, displays, and styles, it says you're using the table style or you're using the block display. So that's really very clear. But if you're using a custom field, it doesn't say what field plugin you're using unless you look at the config export. So in the configuration form for that field plugin, you definitely can add just a bit of markup, and then you have some way of seeing it in the UI. Anyone else got any questions? An example of what kind of example were you thinking, CC? Yeah, so altering the table, that would be in the views query plugin, or for views access plugin, yeah, you can select what plugin you're using. There's 17 plugins, and about half of them you can select which ones you're using through the UI. The fields, filters, and argument plugins are the primary ones that I have found actually useful to override the plugin ID within the configuration. And here, I will just switch sharing screens again. So in the case of this file here, we had a need of including child taxonomy items like that Ford Fiesta example. If they were tagged with Fiesta and someone selected Ford, we needed to show the results for Fiesta as well. And however, in this case, we actually had 3 levels. So it wasn't car types, but for example, Ford Fiesta 2-door. And if someone selected Ford, we only wanted to show the broader categories, not the subcategories. I would have personally, if it had been my design decision, I would have just gone for showing all of them, because adjusting the querying to be only one level was less performant than all levels, but it was what the customer wanted, so it's what we did. It didn't have major performance impacts. We had Redis caching, so yeah, it wasn't what I would have chosen, but it worked well. So to create a custom contextual filter, I've never actually, I'll just go in order here for a minute. So yes, if you want to alter the configuration to use the right plugin ID, you have to do a drush config export, or through the general Drupal UI, export it, change the ID, and then import it, and then make any further changes you want, including, say, filling out the configuration for that new plugin. Generally speaking, you can do views is something you can 100% do as just a configuration file, but I wouldn't want to, and I think it's a rare person that would actually want to just do it by hand without the UI. If you're one, props to you, but that's a long file. So for creating a custom contextual filter, that would be the views argument plugin that I was talking about earlier. There are 3 different plugins there. There's the argument, which is just what kind of argument, whether it's a date, a number, a language, that converts the type that you pass it. If you pass it the right type anyways, if you pass it the wrong type, it may have a conniption, but that's why you have an argument validator to make sure that is the right type of data. You also have the argument default plugin. So if you don't provide it an argument, what will it use as a fallback value? So is there any case that I would prefer a hook over a plugin? Yeah, if it's a one time, if you are altering just one time, like you only want to alter this query if the user is logged in, I might just go for a hook. A hook is less code. It's probably a bit quicker to write. The query takes a bit more time, but is then better performance later. So it's like time versus performance. I've never used a right join within views, but I would do that with a views join plugin. We have the standard, which you actually do have a bit of configuration. So you could probably just subclass this as right join plugin and switch to that. I haven't done enough SQL within the recent couple of years that I would feel confident enough to say how to write a right join that would work for views, but if you're comfortable with SQL, you definitely want to just subclass the join plugin base or the standard views plugin. So contextual filters definitely can resolve entity IDs in the alias. That's often using the query parameter plugin to get the value, but the argument validator for entity is generally speaking what connects the conceivably random number into an actual real entity and loads it to provide you with a preloaded entity, just like a view. I do not currently have that example anywhere. I should have probably put in a couple examples, but in general, if you just look at the Drupal core under core modules, views, source plugin, and then look in the views folder there, you have all of the different plugins and anywhere from 3 to 15 examples of each plugin, depending on the type. Well, it's looking like we're pretty much done. We do have 8 more minutes on the clock. So I have time for more questions, or I can let you quickly get a drink or a snack or whatever before the last session of the day. Thanks, Bree. I feel I think I talk faster when I'm in front of an audience, because when I did this just offhand and with no audience, I came out to be slightly over 45 minutes, not 7 minutes under, with including estimated 10 minutes of questions. So, okay. So I'm just looking at Luke's question. Yes. So there is currently, as far as I know, no validator that specifically will figure out from the node title what you are wanting. I have, for specific projects, created a function that does that, but I'm currently not happy with that and do not have it published because it is quite fragile. You could probably do the same thing. Actually, if you send me a message, I can send you my sample code for that. As I was saying, I do not consider it stable, and it does fail in some cases, but generally speaking, it has been successful in a minimal way. Great. Thanks for coming all. And I'm easily available on Twitter or via the Drupal.org contact form. And otherwise, I'll also be here for the next couple days mostly, so feel free to message me or ask for a voice chat. I'm always happy to talk to people. Thanks. And at the top, you'll see Bethany Lister has posted a link for evaluations. I'd be pleased to have lots of evaluations. Feel free to give me harsh criticism. I accept it. It's much. I love hearing all the thanks, but criticism is the best way to grow.